For more insight on the latest on the war, let's speak with Ryan Bohl. He's Senior Middle East and North Africa Analyst at RANE. Ryan, always good to see you. Thank you very much for talking to us. I want to get a sense right now, because we're into what's the 6th day of the war. How do you think things stand right now? I mean, the escalation seems to be there, seems very concerning, and yet we have the dollar coming down, hinting, or maybe that's more like hoping that this conflict could be short-lived?
Well, I think we're seeing it evolve into an attritional war, and it's a unique attritional war because it's being fought on the seas and through the air, and that gives a different type of impact. In many ways, a lot of the doomsday scenarios for Iran engaging in regional war assumed their capabilities were much more impactful than we have seen so far. They've been localized impacts, individual ships, individual locations, but many of them, most of them, almost 90% in many cases, have been intercepted, and the Iranians have been unwilling to carry out the kind of swarm attacks on energy facilities that would really push us in the direction of a Ukraine-style energy shock. So it's a unique circumstance. This is obviously yet another unprecedented moment, and we're watching the impacts fold out over time. And the longer this war goes on, the greater those impacts almost assuredly will be. But I think there is still a fair bit of hope that the war may come to an end sooner rather than later.
So very quickly, in the meantime, the US says it's going to strike deeper into Iran. What does that actually mean? Because is there anything else beyond the 2,000 targets which have already been hit?
There is a very large military industrial complex throughout Iran that will continue to be a target for the United States and Israel in more or less an open-ended campaign. And this is the really big problem for the Americans and the Israelis. Iran is a very large country. It is a classic geopolitical middle power. It isn't easily pushed around, let alone from the air alone. If the United States truly wants to dismantle its missile program, it has to also dismantle much of its civilian industry that can be dual purpose for the manufacturing of missiles. It also has to carry out significant strikes on Iran's political and technological leadership to both deprive Iran of the will to rebuild that program and to take away their knowledge to do so after the war. Those are huge missions that the Americans have decided to give themselves, and it really does suggest that America's political will stop short of actually accomplishing that mission.
Yeah, Ryan, the U.S. shot down an Iranian missile that was on its way to a Turkish military base that hosts American forces. Turkey is a NATO member. I mean, how significant is this escalation from a strategic standpoint? How close are we to a technical trigger of Article 5?
I think we're still far away from Article 5, in part because the concern about triggering Article 5 is it pulls a great deal of European countries into wars that they certainly don't want to fight, and it implies that this would shift over to a regime change war against the Iranians. After all, Article 5 has only ever been triggered once after 9/11 against the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. I don't think the Turks want to be part of a campaign like that, but they certainly don't want to see the Iranians making it a habit of launching missiles into Turkey to try to pressure the U.S. military presence that is considerable there. So they're in a tricky position where it looks like they'll have to take a position very similar to the Gulf Arabs, endure these strikes as they come, hope that they can mediate an end to the conflict as soon as possible, and restrain themselves from retaliation and getting themselves involved in a ground war that doesn't look like it would have a clean end and would have a significant cost for the Turks.
Ryan, the US also torpedoed an Iranian warship in international waters of Sri Lanka. At first glance, it seems like, okay, it's part of the conflict. But can you help us understand the implications and the possible unintended consequences of doing something like that?
Well, I think the Americans are normalizing in many ways these traditional submarine warfare, this traditional international waters warfare. Now, the Iranians were a very small navy. Most of their navy is now destroyed. And so the Americans never faced a prospect of realistic retaliation. But I do think countries like China and others are looking at this and recognizing that the U.S. is renormalizing a lot of these naval combat norms that many people thought were of ancient history, from World War II and barely even in the Cold War. So the wider implications is that this is the United States resuming the traditional powers of someone who's guaranteeing the trade lanes, but it also implies that other powers might be able to push back if the circumstances are there. It is also, of course, about, in the Iranian sense, sinking the prize of their navy, of further diminishing their naval capabilities, and it does suggest that they will go after other Iranian naval targets, including Iranian tankers, which I am somewhat surprised we haven't seen American troops landing on to take control of so far.
Yeah, Ryan. On China, we're seeing China wade into the picture a bit more prominently now, sending its special envoy on Middle East affairs to the region for mediation. What are China's goals and interests here, and how likely is it that China's efforts will be well received by U.S. and Israel, given its deep economic ties with Iran?
Well, goal number one is restore the flow of energy through Hormuz as soon as possible and guarantee the safety of trade and transit through those straits. They may have some receptive ears from the Iranians on that front, and they may be able to strike localized de-escalation agreements that certain shipping won't be struck, that certain Gulf Arab countries might not be struck. It's possible that they're able to do so since Iran is so close to China and reliant upon it as an economic partner, but they have very little leverage over the Americans and the Israelis. They're going to continue to strike Iran as long as they believe that there are targets that they have to chase as they chase this wider mission, these expansive missions to diminish Iran's nuclear program, its missiles and proxies and political leadership. So China, I think, will be capable of striking localized de-escalation agreements, similar as we've seen with the Russia-Ukraine crisis, where Turkey has played a role in mediating certain transit routes, for example, Ukrainian grain to get out of Ukraine over time. But I don't think they're in a good position to be able to mediate an end to the conflict. That really will run through Washington. It'll be America that declares the mission accomplished, even if the mission isn't accomplished.
Ryan, we know, of course, that Xi Jinping and Donald Trump have a meeting later this month into early April. I'm wondering if that is a priority in terms of stability as far as Xi Jinping is concerned. I mean, we do, of course, know that Nicolas Maduro and the late Ayatollah were close allies of China.
Well, so far, I haven't seen signs that China is willing to cancel that meeting yet, and the Americans are trying to signal that the war may be wrapped up right around then. I don't think the meeting itself is necessarily driving the timeline, and so it's possible that it gets delayed or scheduled. But I do think that that will be a moment where Xi Jinping is sizing up President Trump whenever it happens and trying to figure out exactly what Trump's next move is going to be, because we have seen the Trump administration shown a remarkable willingness to shatter not just domestic and legal norms here in the United States, but internationally as well, from Venezuela to the bombing in Yemen to supporting Israel's very hawkish strategies in Gaza and Lebanon, and now, of course, 2 Iran wars. So I think he will be sizing up President Trump and seeing just where is President Trump's natural limits, what are the constraints that he will react to, and how can China leverage those to restore some sort of stability in the international system.
Well, Ryan, you're seeing the UK and France move from passive observers to active participants. Spain still refusing to participate. Germany seems to be backing US objectives. How do you view the sort of very divided response from Europe, and how significant is this sort of response in this conflict? For example, maybe whether it becomes a long drawn one, or whether it puts a swift end to the conflict with Europe's backing?
Well, the swifter the conflict ends, the less the controversy will haunt transatlantic relations, which are already strained over so many things, from tariffs to Greenland to the erosion of democratic norms here in the United States. We do have Spain as our outlier of saying it won't allow U.S. Forces to use it to strike Iran. It's not really particularly important from a tactical standpoint. The Americans have other bases. But I think the longer this conflict goes on, and particularly if it results in destabilization of Iran and we start to see a refugee flow out of that country, it will further strain relations with Europe, as well as with some of its partners in the Middle East, because Europe will be looking for them to stabilize Iran, and many of those countries will either not be not willing to, or be unable to. So I think the longer that we go along on this conflict, the more that those cracks in the relationship will continue to widen, and the more the governments within Europe will have to take symbolic stances against the United States' campaign against Iran, and the more we'll see protests and others who are trying to interrupt some of the supply chains that are involved with the campaign against Iran, people trying to occupy ports and blocking airports and things like that.
Yeah, Ryan. Just on war developments as well. I mean, what some analysts and experts have been saying is that the outcome and the duration of this war may be decided by who runs out of missiles or interceptors first. Well, the US and Israel, they've reportedly destroyed much of Iran's capability. And if that is true, then can we expect the pace of attacks to slow, at least from the Iranian side? Maybe the Iranian side moving to lower grade or cheaper weapons. And how would this change the trajectory of the war from here?
We've already started to see that. The amount of ballistic missiles going towards Israel and the UAE, which has been one of the #1 targets for the Iranians, has been diminishing the past few days. Now, maybe that's a capacity issue. Maybe it's a launcher issue. Maybe it's a choice of strategy to draw this war out and then therefore keep the stockpile a little more reserved. So we are starting to see this. But both sides do have access to lower technologies that allow them to keep the war going for at least several more weeks. Iran's supply of Shahed drones is more or less limitless. And there is a Russian facility deep inside of Russia that produces these drones that can continue to reinforce the Iranians. And there's no way the Americans are going to be able to strike that facility. In addition to that, they can also continue to use short-range rockets and shorter-range missiles that can strike the Gulf Arab states in more or less an open-ended posture. Meanwhile, as the Americans and the Israelis have now established air dominance over Iran, that allows them to use more of what you might think of as dumb bombs from their lower tech fighters like F-16s. Instead of having to use joint standoff weapons that are at a distance, they can now fly directly over their targets anywhere within Iran and strike from above. And that gives them a different set of munitions that allows them to continue to strike in an open-ended sense. Now, the munitions do matter, though, on the air defense side, because that's the question of America's political resolve. If more Iranian Shaheds or an occasional missile is more likely to cause an energy shock, that is a very big pressure point on President Trump. And it's just a question of when he starts to recognize that real threat to both the American economy as well as his own political capital at home to call an end to the war.
Ryan, a couple of things I want to ask you about. The first is that apparently Iranian intelligence reaching out to say, let's talk. And the other are reports that the late Ayatollah Khamenei's son, Mojtaba, is a possible successor. I'm wondering, whether these two are connected in the sense that Mojtaba is supposed to be a hardliner, while others may be less so. And the U.S. in the meantime, we know also saying that, no active negotiations are taking place. Can you sort of tie all this together for us?
Yeah, I think what this is reflective of is very fog of war right now, but the political leadership has certainly been disrupted within Iran. We do know that the Iranians had kind of off-the-shelf plans that individuals were given throughout the network-based Islamic Republic. It always was not so much based on a single personality, but on many different ones with backups and redundancy, with the expectation, especially after June of 2025, that the next war would involve a round of assassinations. And so the IRGC, Artesh, and others have been given orders that they continue to carry out independent of central leadership, as central leadership is now being reorganized. That could explain some of the behavior, like the attack on Turkey. That may not have been a centrally planned decision. It may have been something carried out by a local commander. And that would also explain some of these signals being sent to the Americans that diplomacy is an option, but that may not be coming from the full establishment. There may be many elements of the IRGC that want to continue to fight for an extended period of time for revenge for Ayatollah Khamenei. Now, the next supreme leader, when that person is finally chosen, whether they're a hardliner or a relative moderate, does define what the post-war scenario is going to look like. But once we have a supreme leader, that will allow Iran to start speaking with a more unified voice, and then we'll be able to start to see where Iran's new strategy will evolve towards. Because right now, we're seeing the shadow of Khamenei's old strategy being enacted in the aftermath of his death.
Understood. Ryan, always great talking to you. Appreciate it very much. Ryan Bohl, a senior Middle East and North Africa analyst at RANE.